The 100 Years' War was a conflict unlike any other in history. It wasn't just a single battle or a few years of fighting. It lasted for over 100 years, from the year 1337 to 1453. This war wasn't a single event, but a series of battles, political moves, and shifting alliances that shaped the course of history. The fighting mostly took place in Europe, and the main players were two powerful countries, England and France. The war involved not just battles between armies, but complex struggles over territories, thrones, and influence. So how did this massive war begin? The root cause of the conflict goes back to territorial disputes, particularly between England and France. The English kings had long held lands in France, including the Duchy of Guyenne, and they also had a claim to the French throne. These territories were valuable for trade and military strategy, and both sides saw them as key to their power. The English monarchy, led by King Edward III, argued that they had the right to the throne of France through their maternal bloodline. However, when the French king, Charles IV, died in 1337 without a direct male heir, the French nobility chose Philip VI of the Valois family to succeed him. This left Edward III angry and determined to press his claim. This wasn't just a fight over land and the throne. It was a war that reflected the growing power of nationalism. At the time, both England and France were still developing as unified nations, and the war played a significant role in that process. National identity, loyalty to one's country, and the idea of ruling over specific territories started to become more important. While the idea of universal monarchy like the Holy Roman Empire faded away, the war would eventually stir the rise of royal power, shifting it away from local nobles and towards stronger centralized kingdoms. Economics also played a huge role in the 100 Years' War. Both countries were trying to control lucrative trade routes, particularly in the wool industry, which was important for the English economy. For France, the vineyards and farmlands of the south were vital to their economic success, and England's control over parts of France threatened that. This economic pressure added to the tension, turning what could have been a simple dispute over territory into a much bigger and more brutal conflict. One of the earliest moments of the war was marked by a series of confrontations. After Edward III declared himself the rightful king of France in 1337, the French began to rally behind their own king, Philip VI. By 1339, the English were able to push further into French territory, with Edward launching several successful raids. One of the most notable early battles of the war was the Battle of Sluys in 1350, where the English navy decisively defeated the French, securing their dominance of the English Channel for much of the war. This victory gave England a strong foothold, especially since control of the Channel was essential for trading and moving armies. As the war continued, it became clear that it wasn't just about one conflict, but a long, drawn-out series of battles, sieges, and shifting strategies. The war also saw the rise of important figures who would shape the history of the conflict, such as Joan of Arc, who would later inspire the French resistance and help turn the tide against the English. But for now, in these early years, both sides were heavily engaged in battles for land, control, and influence. It seemed that neither side would easily gain a clear advantage. The 100 Years' War had truly begun, and with it, a new chapter in European history was unfolding. But this was just the beginning, and much more lay ahead. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the struggles, alliances, and turning points of this centuries-long conflict. The 100 Years' War took a dramatic turn as the conflict progressed, and in the middle of all this fighting, Europe faced one of the most devastating natural disasters in history, the Black Death. Beginning in the year 1347, the Black Death spread rapidly across the continent, hitting both England and France hard. The plague, carried by fleas on rats, devastated populations, killing millions. It's believed that between 1/3 and half of Europe's population was wiped out by the disease. The war itself had already been grueling, but now, with entire villages and towns decimated by this deadly outbreak, both the English and the French found themselves dealing with something far more dangerous than the enemy armies on the battlefield. As the plague spread, it didn't just impact the soldiers who fought in the war, but the general population as well. Towns and cities were left without workers, and the economic structures of both kingdoms began to crumble. In many places, entire villages were left empty, their buildings abandoned as people fled or died. The social structure of Europe was completely disrupted. Farmers, artisans, and laborers were gone, and those left behind were in constant fear of falling ill themselves. This created chaos as resources became scarce and the demand for goods outstripped the supply. The Black Death also had a significant effect on the war itself. Both England and France had been deeply involved in a cycle of battles, sieges, and territorial disputes, but the plague caused delays and changes in strategies. With soldiers falling ill and dying in large numbers, armies found it harder to keep up the fight. In some areas, military campaigns were paused, and the war was effectively put on hold for a time. Yet even during these pauses, the political tensions between the two nations didn't ease. The French were struggling with their own leadership problems as King Charles VI, who reigned from 1380 to 1422, was severely affected by periods of mental illness. This left the French throne vulnerable, leading to internal conflict and allowing the English to gain some advantages during this difficult period. But despite the plague and the mental instability of French leadership, the war continued to rage on. In the year 1359, the English gained control of Paris after the French king was forced to sign a peace treaty, but the peace was short-lived. The English faced constant rebellions, uprisings, and battles that stretched their resources and manpower. Still, they continued to push forward, driven by the belief that they had a legitimate claim to the French throne. Meanwhile, the French were not easily defeated. Despite internal struggles, the people of France began to rally behind a young peasant girl, Joan of Arc. Born around 1400, Joan's rise to fame was both inspirational and extraordinary. At just 16 years old, she claimed to have received visions from saints telling her to help France reclaim its throne. Her leadership and unwavering faith in her mission made her a symbol of resistance. In 1430, after leading the French army to a crucial victory at Orléans, Joan became the face of French nationalism, and her involvement in the war boosted the morale of her countrymen. Sadly, Joan's journey was short-lived. She was captured by the English in 1431 and later executed. However, her legacy lived on, and she became a martyr who symbolized the determination and resilience of the French people. By the time the war reached its final stages, both sides were exhausted, and the political and social upheaval of the time had taken its toll. The Black Death had already altered the course of European society, and now the war was entering its final phase. By the year 1453, the English had lost nearly all their territories in France, marking the end of the conflict. France had emerged victorious, but the lasting effects of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death would be felt for generations. The war, combined with the devastation of the plague, had forever changed the landscape of Europe. Both England and France had suffered enormous losses in terms of human life, land, and resources. The political structures of both nations had been shaken to their core. Yet despite everything, the war showed how nations and people can endure through the hardest of times. As the war between England and France raged on, it became clear that the 100 Years' War was not just about territorial disputes. It was a battle for national identity. Over time, the conflict began to evolve, and the role of the monarchy in shaping the fate of both nations became more evident. In England, King Edward III's early successes in the war had earned him widespread support, and the English had gained significant territory in France. However, the war's long duration meant that the people of both countries began to grow weary of the ongoing violence and loss. Edward III's death in 1377 marked a turning point for England. His grandson, Richard II, became king at a very young age, and this change in leadership brought instability to England. Richard II's reign was marked by rising internal tensions, especially the infamous Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The revolt was fueled by the harsh economic conditions caused by the war, as well as the lingering effects of the Black Death. Many workers had died, and the remaining peasants were forced to work longer hours for lower wages. This discontent led to violent uprisings, which were brutally suppressed by the English crown. Meanwhile, France was also struggling to find stability. Charles VI, who had become king in 1380, faced constant challenges to his rule. His mental illness, which would last for much of his reign, left France vulnerable to both internal divisions and external threats. While France's nobility fought amongst themselves for power, the English capitalized on the chaos, expanding their control over vast swaths of French territory. By the year 1400, England had gained control of almost half of France, including the crucial northern regions. However, the fortunes of war began to shift in the early 15th century. The French, despite their internal struggles, began to reorganize their forces and leadership. The rise of Joan of Arc was a significant turning point. Her divine visions and leadership inspired the French army to reclaim important cities like Orléans. Joan's victories were not just military successes, they were also symbolic. She became a symbol of hope for the French people and a rallying figure that united the country's divided factions. Her courage and dedication turned the tide of the war in France's favor, even though her eventual capture and execution by the English in 1431 was a tragic loss for the French cause. Joan's death, however, did not extinguish the French spirit. By the year 1439, the French King Charles VII had managed to solidify his hold over much of the country, and the English were starting to retreat. A critical shift occurred during the Battle of Formigny in 1445, where the French achieved a decisive victory. This battle marked the beginning of the end for English hopes of maintaining control over France. The French, aided by the revitalized leadership and a growing sense of national unity, began to push the English out of their territory. Meanwhile, the English crown was grappling with its own challenges. After years of costly military campaigns and the devastating effects of the Black Death, England's economy was in shambles. The toll of the war was heavy on both the military and the civilians. The English soldiers were stretched thin, and their morale was low. The French, buoyed by their recent successes and a renewed sense of purpose, continued to drive the English forces back. By the year 1453, the final stages of the war were underway. The English had lost the crucial Battle of Castillon, and the French were rapidly reclaiming their land. This marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War. The Treaty of Picquigny, signed in 1460, formally ended hostilities between the two nations, though England would not fully relinquish its claim to French territory until much later. The 100 Years' War had left an indelible mark on both England and France. It reshaped the political and social landscapes of both countries and solidified the concept of nationalism. The war also had long-lasting effects on the military tactics of the time, with the introduction of new technologies such as the longbow, which proved to be a key weapon in the conflict. The war was also a catalyst for changes in warfare and leadership, setting the stage for future conflicts in Europe. Despite the immense loss of life, resources, and land, the 100 Years' War ultimately resulted in the emergence of stronger, more centralized monarchies in both countries. France, once divided and vulnerable, emerged victorious and unified under Charles VII. England, though defeated, began to turn inward, eventually focusing its efforts on rebuilding and dealing with internal conflicts, particularly the War of the Roses, which would erupt shortly after the 100 Years' War concluded. The war had reshaped the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects, forever changing the course of European history. It also reinforced the idea that wars were not just fought for land or power, but for the very identity of a nation. As France and England rebuilt after the war, the memory of the 100 Years' War would remain a significant part of their shared history. As the 100 Years' War came to an end, the impact of this prolonged conflict could still be felt across Europe. Both England and France, though exhausted and deeply scarred by the violence and destruction, found themselves on the precipice of change. The years of bloodshed, battles, and political instability had left their mark, but they also opened the door to significant social, economic, and cultural transformations. One of the most lasting effects of the war was the shift in the power dynamics between the monarchy and the people. The war had proven that the strength of a nation relied not just on the crown, but also on the unity of its people. In France, this newfound sense of unity was particularly evident. The war had forced the French to come together, despite internal divisions and the chaos that had plagued the country. This sense of nationalism, which had been a major driving force behind the French resistance during the conflict, would continue to grow and shape the future of France in the centuries to come. For England, the aftermath of the war was marked by internal strife. The defeat in France left the English crown weakened and struggling to maintain control. The loss of French territories and the heavy financial burden of the war led to growing dissatisfaction among the English nobility and common people alike. This unrest would soon lead to one of the most turbulent periods in English history, the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses, which began in 1455, was a civil conflict between the two main branches of the English royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York. The war was rooted in the instability that followed the loss of France, and the increasing inability of the monarchy to manage the country's affairs. The political tension that had built up during the 100 Years' War came to a head, leading to a series of battles that would ultimately result in the rise of the Tudor dynasty. While England was embroiled in its own civil war, France, under the leadership of Charles VII, was beginning the difficult task of rebuilding. The devastation caused by the war, coupled with the aftermath of the Black Death, had left much of the country in ruins. But Charles VII, taking lessons from the war, worked to strengthen the monarchy and centralize power, solidifying his rule over a now unified France. The French people, weary from the years of fighting, found themselves looking to the monarchy for stability and guidance. In addition to political shifts, the war had lasting economic consequences for both nations. The cost of the war had drained both England and France's resources. In England, the loss of French territories meant the loss of valuable income from land and trade. For France, the war had devastated the economy, especially in the regions that had seen the heaviest fighting. The destruction of farmland, towns, and infrastructure had left a country struggling to recover. The aftermath of the war also saw significant changes in the military landscape. The 100 Years' War had been a turning point in the development of military technology and tactics. The use of the longbow, which had proven so effective in battles like Agincourt, became a symbol of English military success. France, on the other hand, began to adapt its military tactics as well, learning from its defeats and integrating more advanced artillery into its forces. The war had shown that battles were not just won by knights and cavalry, but by new strategies and technologies that would define warfare in the coming centuries. The war also influenced the culture of both nations. The trauma of the war, along with the rise of new monarchies, led to a flourishing of the arts in France. The late medieval period saw the growth of Gothic architecture, as well as the development of new forms of literature and music. In England, the end of the war and the rise of the Tudors brought with it a renewed focus on national pride and identity, which would later influence the works of playwrights like William Shakespeare. In the broader context of Europe, the 100 Years' War had profound effects on the relationships between nations. The war had highlighted the importance of diplomacy, alliances, and the shifting nature of power on the continent. The balance of power in Europe was forever altered, and the war's legacy would continue to shape the political landscape for generations to come. Though the 100 Years' War had ended, its effects would resonate for centuries. The war had reshaped the idea of what it meant to be a nation, and the lessons learned during those long years of conflict would influence how future wars were fought and how nations interacted with each other. As England and France moved forward, they would both carry the scars of the war, but they would also carry the memories of the victories and losses that had defined their identities. As the 100 Years' War came to a close, both England and France faced the task of rebuilding in the aftermath of such an extensive and destructive conflict. The war had left its mark on the people, the land, and the political landscape, with deep scars that would take decades, if not centuries, to heal. Yet even as the final battles were fought and the peace was established, the legacies of the war continued to shape the future. One of the most significant changes after the war was the shift in power structures within both countries. For England, the loss of its French territories and the toll of the war on its resources marked the beginning of a new era of internal instability. The social and political unrest created by the heavy burden of war costs and the loss of international influence sparked a deep divide within the nobility. This unrest was a key factor that led to the War of the Roses, which began in 1455 and would continue for decades. The war between the houses of Lancaster and York was a direct result of the weakened English monarchy, which struggled to maintain control in the wake of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, France emerged from the war with a more centralized monarchy. King Charles VII, who had been crowned under the shadow of war, worked hard to consolidate his power, using the lessons of the war to strengthen the French state. By the time the war ended, the monarchy had gained greater authority and control over the feudal system. In the process, France's social structure began to shift, with increased power flowing from local nobles to the central government. The French victory also fostered a renewed sense of nationalism and unity as the people rallied behind the idea of a strong, unified France. This newfound national identity would be an important catalyst for future developments, including the French Revolution centuries later. The war had also driven significant changes in military tactics and technology. The 100 Years' War marked a major turning point in the evolution of European warfare. The use of the longbow by English archers was a notable innovation, and its effectiveness on the battlefield forever altered the role of knights and cavalry in battle. Additionally, the war saw the increasing use of gunpowder weapons, particularly cannons, which would later become a defining feature of European conflicts. As both nations looked toward the future, military technology would continue to evolve. paving the way for new strategies in warfare. Economically, the war had devastated both countries. France, in particular, had suffered from widespread destruction, especially in the regions that had seen the worst of the fighting. The war had torn apart towns, villages, and farmlands, leaving much of the countryside in ruins. The French economy, already weakened by the Black Death and previous conflicts, now had to contend with the costs of rebuilding. For England, the loss of its territories in France meant the loss of valuable trade routes and income, further exacerbating the financial strain. Both countries would take years to recover from the economic damage wrought by the war, with France eventually using the opportunity to rebuild its infrastructure and re-establish trade routes. Despite the devastation, the 100 Years' War also sparked important cultural developments. In France, the war and the recovery that followed gave rise to a flourishing of Gothic art and architecture, as well as the rise of new forms of literature and philosophy. In England, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new chapter for the country. The emergence of the Tudor dynasty with the rise of Henry VII brought a renewed sense of stability. This period saw a rise in English nationalism, which would later influence the works of famous playwrights such as William Shakespeare. The consequences of the 100 Years' War also stretched far beyond England and France. The conflict had altered the balance of power in Europe, and the shift in political dynamics affected neighboring regions. The weakening of feudalism and the rise of more centralized monarchies set the stage for future conflicts and changes in governance across Europe. The war's impact on the social and economic fabric of Europe would continue to be felt for generations, shaping the course of European history in the centuries that followed. In the end, the 100 Years' War was a conflict that transformed both nations, Europe and the world. It was a war marked by brutal battles, shifting alliances, and profound changes in military, political, and social structures. Its legacy lasted far beyond the peace treaties of 1453, influencing the future of warfare, governance, and culture in ways that could not have been imagined at the time. The war taught the world hard lessons about the cost of prolonged conflict and the importance of diplomacy in maintaining peace. And though the war itself is long over, the echoes of its impact can still be heard today, shaping the course of history and reminding us of the lasting consequences of power struggles, territorial disputes, and human endurance.